In 332 BCE, a 24-year-old conqueror stood on the coast of what is now Lebanon and stared at an impossible problem. Half a mile of open water separated him from an island fortress that had never fallen. So Alexander the Great did something no military commander had ever attempted. He decided to build a road through the ocean itself. Alexander of Macedon had conquered half the known world by the time he reached the shores of Phoenicia. City after city had opened their gates to him. Empires had crumbled before his phalanx. He had defeated the mighty Persian army at Issus, sending their emperor Darius fleeing for his life. Every coastal city from Greece to Egypt had surrendered without a fight. Every city except one. Tyre was different. This wasn't just another city. It was the jewel of Phoenicia, the greatest naval power in the Mediterranean, a merchant empire that had stood for over 2,000 years. The Tyrians were master shipbuilders, traders who had sailed to the edges of the known world, establishing colonies from Cyprus to Carthage, even venturing beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic Ocean. But Tyre's greatest advantage wasn't its wealth or its ships. It was geography. The original city had once stood on the mainland, but centuries earlier, the Tyrians had abandoned it and rebuilt their entire civilization on a rocky island half a mile offshore. They surrounded it with walls that rose 150 feet high, constructed from massive blocks of stone that seemed to grow directly out of the sea itself. These weren't ordinary fortifications. They were considered the most formidable defensive structures in the ancient world. From their impregnable island, the Tyrians controlled Mediterranean trade. Their ships carried purple dye made from murex snails, a color so expensive only kings could afford it. They traded in glass, timber from the cedars of Lebanon, and slaves. Their sailors were so skilled that other nations hired them to command their fleets. When Alexander sent ambassadors to Tyre, requesting permission to enter the city and sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, the Tyrian god they associated with Hercules, the city's leaders understood what this really meant. Allowing Alexander into their city would mean submission. It would mean acknowledging him as their master. The Tyrians sent back a message that shocked Alexander's commanders: no. They told Alexander he could sacrifice at the old temple on the mainland, but the island was forbidden to him. They would remain neutral in his war with Persia. They would trade with him, treat him with respect, but they would not surrender their sovereignty. For any other conqueror, this might have been acceptable. But Alexander was not any other conqueror. His rage was immediate and absolute. No one refused Alexander the Great. No city that stood in his way could be allowed to remain independent. More importantly, Tyre's powerful navy posed a genuine strategic threat. While Alexander marched inland toward Persia, Tyrian ships could supply Persian forces, raid his supply lines, or even sail to Greece and threaten his homeland. But there was another reason, one that his generals understood even if they didn't speak it aloud. Alexander believed he was destined for godhood. He believed himself descended from Achilles and Hercules. A god-king could not be denied by mortal merchants. His chief engineer, Jutta, assessed the situation and delivered devastating news. A naval assault was impossible. The Tyrians had 2 harbors protected by chains and booms, defended by the finest warships in the world. Their walls rose directly from deep water, making siege towers useless. Starvation wouldn't work. The island was resupplied constantly by sea. Every military expert agreed, Tyre was untakeable. Alexander's response was simple: then we will walk to it. His plan was audacious to the point of madness. If he couldn't sail to the island, he would build a causeway. A massive bridge of stone and timber that would stretch half a mile across open water, wide enough for siege towers and thousands of soldiers. He would literally create new land connecting the mainland to Tyre's walls. No one had ever attempted such an engineering feat in military history. The Tyrians, watching from their walls, laughed. Let the mad Macedonian try, they thought. The sea would swallow his causeway long before it reached their gates. They had no idea what was coming. Alexander wasn't just building a road through the ocean. He was about to wage a siege that would rewrite the rules of warfare forever, and transform the Mediterranean coastline itself in ways that would last for over 2,000 years. The impossible siege of Tyre was about to begin. The first stones went into the water in January of 332 BCE. What happened next was one of the most audacious engineering projects in ancient history. Alexander didn't just commit his army to this impossible task. He conscripted every available man from the surrounding region. Tens of thousands of workers descended upon the ruins of old Tyre on the mainland. The abandoned city became a quarry. Buildings that had stood for centuries were torn apart, block by block. Houses, temples, defensive walls, nothing was sacred. Every stone became material for the causeway. The Macedonian engineers designed the mole, as it came to be known, to be 200 feet wide. This wasn't just a bridge. It was a moving fortress, wide enough for siege engines, protective screens, and thousands of soldiers to advance simultaneously. The scale was unprecedented. The construction began in the shallows, where the work was backbreaking but straightforward. Workers drove massive wooden pilings into the seabed, creating a framework. Then came the stones, thousands upon thousands of them. Limestone blocks, some weighing several tons, were lowered into position. Timber reinforcements were added. Rubble and smaller rocks filled the gaps. Layer upon layer, the causeway began to take shape. For the first few weeks, the Tyrians watched with amusement. From their towering walls, they could see the ant-like figures of Alexander's army laboring in the shallow water. Their mockery echoed across the waves. They shouted insults and made obscene gestures. Some historians record that they even asked Alexander if he thought himself greater than Poseidon, the god of the sea. But as January turned to February, the laughter began to fade. The causeway was growing. What had seemed like a futile gesture was becoming real. The mole stretched further and further from shore, an unnatural peninsula of stone and timber reaching toward their island like an accusing finger. The Tyrians realized they had underestimated the young conqueror. This wasn't going to stop. Their response was swift and brutal. Tyrian warships, the finest in the Mediterranean, began launching raids against the construction. They would sail close to the causeway and rain arrows down upon the workers. Hundreds of men died, shot down while carrying stones or driving pilings. Some were killed by javelins thrown from Tyrian ships. Others simply drowned when they fell from the causeway into the deep water beyond. Alexander's engineers adapted. They constructed two massive siege towers on the causeway itself, mobile fortresses that could be pushed forward as the mole extended. These towers rose over 150 feet high, matching the height of Tyre's walls. They were sheathed in leather soaked in vinegar to prevent fire, and bristled with catapults and archers. From these towers, Macedonian soldiers could now fight back. When Tyrian ships approached, they were met with volleys of arrows and stones launched from the catapults. The construction workers gained some protection, and the work accelerated. But the Tyrians had one more card to play, and it was devastating. On a moonless night in early March, the defenders prepared their secret weapon. They took an old transport ship and filled it with dried branches, pitch, sulfur, and anything else that would burn. They hung cauldrons of oil from the yardarms. Then they set the rigging to catch the wind and aimed it directly at the causeway. As the fire ship drifted toward Alexander's siege towers, Tyrian commandos aboard waited until the last possible moment. When they were almost upon the wooden structures, they lit the entire vessel ablaze and dove into the dark water, swimming back to Tyre. The fireship struck the siege towers with devastating effect. The flames spread instantly. The leather hides, dried by weeks of Mediterranean sun despite the vinegar treatment, caught fire. The timber framework became a massive pyre. Men screamed as they tried to escape the inferno. Some jumped into the sea and drowned. Others burned alive. But the nightmare wasn't over. As Alexander's soldiers rushed to fight the fire, Tyrian ships appeared out of the darkness. Commandos leaped onto the causeway and began tearing apart the fortifications. They destroyed catapults, burned protective screens, and killed anyone who stood in their way. By the time they retreated, both siege towers were destroyed, and a significant section of the causeway was damaged. Then the weather turned against Alexander. A massive storm rolled in from the Mediterranean, bringing waves that crashed against the causeway with terrible force. The sea that Alexander sought to conquer was fighting back. Sections of the mole collapsed. Weeks of work disappeared beneath the waves. Timber pilings snapped like twigs. Stones that had taken dozens of men to position were scattered across the seabed. Alexander's generals approached him with a painful truth: they should abandon the siege. They had already wasted months on this obsession. Tyre could be left isolated and bypassed. Darius and the Persian army were regrouping in the east. Every day spent building this causeway was a day the enemy grew stronger. Alexander's response was absolute. He would not withdraw. He would not fail. If the causeway had been too narrow, they would build it wider. If the towers had burned, they would construct new ones. If the sea destroyed their work, they would rebuild it stronger. But he needed ships. He needed a navy to challenge Tyre's dominance of the waters. And this is where Alexander's earlier conquests paid unexpected dividends. Word reached him that the Phoenician cities to the north, Sidon, Byblos, Audacious, were sending their fleets to join him. These were Tyre's sister cities, fellow Phoenicians who had submitted to Alexander months earlier. Their kings had been serving with the Persian fleet, but when they learned that Darius had fled and Alexander controlled their home cities, they made a calculated decision. They sailed home and pledged their ships to the conqueror. 80 Phoenician warships arrived at the siege. Then came vessels from Rhodes and Cyprus, adding another 120 ships. Alexander suddenly commanded a fleet of over 200 vessels, crewed by some of the finest sailors in the Mediterranean. The balance of power had shifted. The Tyrians, looking out from their walls, realized with growing horror that they were no longer safe. The sea, their greatest protection, was about to become a prison. Alexander ordered construction to resume. This time, the causeway would be wider, stronger, and protected by the most powerful fleet in the eastern Mediterranean. The impossible was about to become inevitable. The real siege was about to begin. With his new armada, Alexander transformed the siege into something Tyre had never faced before: total encirclement. The Phoenician and Cypriot ships formed a blockade around the entire island. No vessel could enter or leave. For the first time in its history, Tyre was cut off from the sea that had sustained it for millennia. The merchant ships that had brought food, supplies, and wealth couldn't break through. The colonies that Tyre had established across the Mediterranean, Carthage, Cadiz, countless others, were powerless to help their mother city. Inside the walls, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The Tyrians had always believed the sea made them invincible. Now it had become their prison. Alexander didn't just rebuild the causeway. He made it a monument to human determination. The new mole was expanded to nearly 250 feet wide in some sections. Engineers drove pilings deeper into the seabed, learning from the storm that had destroyed their earlier work. They angled the causeway to better resist the waves. Massive boulders, some weighing tons, were sunk into the water to create a foundation that the sea couldn't easily destroy. The work continued day and night. Torches illuminated the causeway after sunset, and the sound of hammers, the grinding of stone, and the shouts of foremen never ceased. Alexander himself was often seen among the workers, not just supervising but laboring alongside them. Ancient sources tell us he carried stones, drove pilings, and worked until his hands bled. This wasn't just leadership. It was psychological warfare. His men saw their king, a man who claimed descent from gods, covered in sweat and dirt like any common laborer. How could they do less? The Tyrians, watching from their walls, saw a level of commitment that was terrifying. This man would not stop. He would not accept defeat. He would build his road across the sea or die trying. By early May, the causeway had reached the halfway point. But now the engineers faced their greatest challenge. The water here was deep, in some places over 18 feet. The currents were stronger. Every stone they dropped seemed to disappear into the depths. The seabed was no longer solid rock but mud and silt that couldn't support the massive weight they were trying to place upon it. The Tyrians saw their opportunity. Their divers, the best in the ancient world, began swimming out to the causeway under cover of darkness. They would dive down and use ropes and hooks to pull stones out of position. Sometimes they would attach ropes to the wooden pilings and have ships drag them out. It was dangerous, exhausting work, but it was effective. Progress on the causeway slowed to a crawl. Alexander's response was characteristically brutal and innovative. He stationed ships along the causeway with nets suspended into the water. Tyrian divers who came too close were caught and killed. He had his own divers, recruited from coastal communities, begin reinforcing the underwater foundations with massive stones that couldn't easily be moved. He even had some of his engineers develop primitive underwater construction techniques, working in diving bells, leather bags filled with air that allowed men to work briefly beneath the surface. But the Tyrians had their own innovations. They understood that once the causeway reached their walls, Alexander would bring up his siege engines. So they made their walls higher. Workers labored day and night to add another story to the fortifications facing the causeway. They constructed wooden hoardings, covered platforms that jutted out from the walls, allowing defenders to drop stones and burning oil directly down onto attackers below. They also prepared their most devastating defensive weapon, boulders heated red-hot in furnaces, then dropped using cranes onto the causeway and ships. When these superheated stones struck wood or struck men, the results were horrific. The stones would stick to whatever they hit, burning through shields, timber, and flesh. Men who tried to remove them would have their hands seared to the bone. Alexander's engineers countered by covering the siege towers with thick hides soaked in water and vinegar. They constructed protective screens made from woven vines and fresh leather that could absorb the impact of the heated stones. The siege became a deadly competition of innovation, each side developing new weapons and defenses in response to the other's tactics. By June, the causeway was within arrow range of the walls. The real battle was about to begin. Alexander now deployed his full arsenal. He had ships fitted with massive battering rams, bronze-tipped logs suspended from reinforced frameworks. These naval rams weren't designed to sink ships but to strike walls. The vessels would approach Tyre's fortifications and pound the stones with rhythmic, devastating force. The sound echoed across the water like thunder. Day after day, the rams struck the same sections of wall, searching for weaknesses. Other ships carried catapults and ballistae. Massive mechanical artillery that could hurl stones weighing 60 pounds or more. These bombarded the walls continuously, trying to break down the fortifications or kill defenders. The Tyrians responded with their own artillery, and the air between the causeway and the city was constantly filled with flying projectiles. But the Tyrians had one more desperate tactic. They lowered enormous leather curtains stuffed with seaweed down the face of their walls. These cushions absorbed the impact of the battering rams and catapult stones. When projectiles struck them, they simply bounced off or embedded themselves harmlessly in the seaweed. Alexander's frustration grew. His engineers tried cutting the cushions with hooked poles. The Tyrians dropped heated sand on the men attempting this, it poured through gaps in their armor and burned their skin. Some men, driven mad by the pain, threw themselves into the sea to escape the burning. The siege had become a nightmare of innovation and suffering. Both sides were locked in a struggle where retreat meant death, for the Tyrians, death at Macedonian hands, for Alexander, death to his reputation and his claim to godhood. By July, after 7 months of siege, the causeway finally touched Tyre's walls. Alexander had done the impossible, he had built a road through the ocean. But the walls still stood, higher and stronger than ever. The Tyrians had enough supplies to last months more. Their walls had withstood everything Alexander had thrown at them. The city had not fallen. But Alexander had one final, devastating assault planned. He had studied the island's defenses for months. He knew where the walls were oldest. He knew where the harbors were weakest. And he was about to strike with everything he had, a coordinated assault by land and sea that would either break Tyre's defenses forever or break his army trying. The bloodiest day of the siege was coming. And when it arrived, it would be more terrible than anyone could imagine. July 332 BCE. The siege had lasted 7 months. Alexander had lost thousands of men. He had spent a fortune in gold and resources. His generals had begged him to abandon this obsession. The Persian king Darius was regrouping in Babylon, building a new army. Every strategic calculation said Alexander should move on. But Alexander the Great did not calculate like other men. He gave the order for a final, overwhelming assault. It would be coordinated from every direction simultaneously. Something no besieged city had ever faced. The attack would come from the causeway, from ships against the walls, from both harbors at once. Tyre would be struck from all sides with the full weight of Alexander's army and his entire fleet. The assault began at dawn. On the causeway, 2 massive siege towers rolled forward on wooden wheels, pushed by hundreds of men. These were not the towers that had burned months earlier. These were improved, reinforced, covered in metal plates and soaked hides. They stood over 160 feet tall, taller even than Tyre's enhanced walls. Inside each tower were multiple levels of platforms, packed with archers, javelin throwers, and assault troops. As the towers approached, Tyrian defenders unleashed everything they had. Arrows darkened the sky. Catapults hurled stones that struck the towers with sounds like thunder. Red-hot metal and burning sand rained down on the attackers. Men screamed as they burned. The wounded fell from the towers into the gap between the causeway and the walls, dropping onto rocks and debris below. But Alexander's towers kept advancing. When they finally reached the walls, their drawbridges slammed down. Macedonian shock troops, the hypaspists, Alexander's elite guard, charged across. These were veterans who had fought from Greece to Egypt. They wore bronze armor and carried short swords designed for close combat. They were chosen not just for skill but for absolute fearlessness. The fighting on the walls was savage. In the narrow space atop the fortifications, there was no room for formation tactics or strategy. It was brutal, intimate violence. Men wrestled and stabbed. They bit and gouged. Bodies fell from the walls on both sides. The Tyrians were fighting for their families, their homes, their very existence. They fought with the desperation of men who knew defeat meant death. For an hour, the Macedonians couldn't break through. The Tyrians held the walls. But Alexander had planned for this. While the causeway assault drew defenders to that section of wall, his ships were executing their part of the plan. On the southern side of the island, where Tyre's walls were oldest and had taken the most punishment from battering rams over the preceding weeks, Alexander had positioned his most powerful naval units. These ships carried the heaviest rams and were crewed by Phoenician sailors who knew these waters intimately. They had once served Tyre itself. The rams struck in unison, targeting the same weakened section. Once. Twice. 3 times. The ancient stones, which had stood for centuries, finally yielded. A section of wall collapsed into the sea with a roar that could be heard across the island. Stone blocks, some weighing tons, tumbled into the waves. Dust billowed up. The breach was open. Alexander's ships surged forward. The first vessels to push through the gap carried his hypaspists. They leaped from the ships onto the rubble, scrambling over broken stones into the city itself. Behind them came more ships, more men, an unstoppable tide of Macedonian soldiers pouring through the breach. At the same moment, Alexander launched his assault on the harbors. Tyrian ships had been chained across both harbor entrances for months, creating barriers that seemed impenetrable. But Alexander's Phoenician captains knew a secret. At certain tides and with skilled seamanship, vessels could be forced through the gaps. They rammed the Tyrian ships, breaking the chains. Other vessels used grappling hooks to drag the defensive ships aside. The harbors fell within minutes. Suddenly, Alexander's fleet was inside Tyre's defenses, landing troops directly into the heart of the city. The Tyrians, seeing enemies pouring in from three directions, understood that the end had come. But they did not surrender. What followed was one of the most brutal massacres in ancient warfare. The Tyrians retreated into the narrow streets of their city and fought building by building, room by room. Alexander's soldiers, enraged by 7 months of losses and frustration, showed no mercy. They killed every armed man they encountered. They killed men who threw down their weapons. They killed old men and boys. Ancient historians tell us that 8,000 Tyrians died that day. The streets ran with blood. Bodies piled in the narrow alleys. The smell of death filled the air, mixed with smoke from burning buildings. The Macedonians set fires as they advanced, burning out defenders who tried to barricade themselves in homes and temples. Some Tyrians tried to surrender. They gathered in the sacred precinct of the Temple of Melkart, the very place where Alexander had wanted to sacrifice months earlier. They held up olive branches and begged for mercy. But the Macedonian troops, their blood up from hours of brutal combat, cut them down anyway. Only when Alexander himself entered the city, escorted by his bodyguards, did the killing finally slow. He gave orders to spare those who had taken refuge in temples and to stop the indiscriminate slaughter. But the damage was done. 2,000 Tyrian men, those who had been captured alive, were crucified. Alexander had them nailed to crosses along the beach, stretching for miles. It was a message to every other city that might consider resisting him: this is what defiance costs. 30,000 survivors, mostly women, children, and elderly, were sold into slavery. Entire families were separated, never to see each other again. They were dispersed across the Mediterranean world, their proud Phoenician heritage reduced to property to be bought and sold in markets from Athens to Alexandria. The king of Tyre and a handful of nobles who had taken refuge in the Temple of Melkart were spared, but only because Alexander finally got what he had wanted 7 months earlier. He entered the temple and performed his sacrifice to Hercules. He rededicated the temple to himself, claiming his rightful place among the gods. But Alexander's victory came at an enormous cost. Modern historians estimate he lost between 400 and 1,000 men during the siege. A staggering number for ancient warfare, where battles often ended after dozens of casualties. The financial cost was equally devastating. The siege had consumed months of time and vast resources that could have been used to pursue Darius. Yet Alexander had proven something that would echo through military history for centuries. He had shown that no fortification was truly impregnable. No city was safe from a commander willing to pay any price, sacrifice any number of men, and attempt the impossible. The causeway remained, a permanent testament to human will triumphing over nature. Over time, sand and silt accumulated around it. The temporary military structure became a permanent land bridge. The island of Tyre ceased to be an island at all. Alexander had not just conquered a city. He had literally reshaped the geography of the Mediterranean coast. And he had done so through sheer, terrifying determination. But as his men celebrated their victory among the ruins and the bodies, as they divided the spoils and counted their dead, one question remained: had it been worth it? 2,358 years have passed since Alexander's causeway touched the walls of Tyre. The conqueror is long dead. His empire fragmented within years of his passing. The Macedonians, the Persians, the kingdoms that fought over his legacy, all have turned to dust. But Alexander's causeway remains. If you visit Tyre today, in modern-day Lebanon, you won't find an island. The causeway that Alexander built as a temporary military structure became permanent. Centuries of waves deposited sand and sediment around it. The narrow bridge widened. What was once a half-mile of open water is now solid ground. Tyre is a peninsula, forever connected to the mainland by the road a 24-year-old conqueror built through sheer force of will. The land bridge is now covered by modern buildings, streets, and a thriving city. But beneath the pavement and concrete, Alexander's stones remain. Archaeologists have confirmed it. The causeway that ancient sources described in such detail is still there, buried under 23 centuries of accumulated earth and human construction. In a very literal sense, Alexander changed the map. He rewrote geography itself. The discoveries rewrote what historians thought they knew about the expedition's final chapter. Tyre had been found 96 kilometers south of where the ships had reportedly been abandoned. That's an enormous distance for an unmanned vessel to drift, or was she unmanned? The closed hatches suggested purpose, not abandonment. Some researchers now theorize that a few crew members might have returned to one or both ships after the initial evacuation, attempting to sail them to safety. Perhaps some men had realized that abandoning ship had been a fatal mistake and tried to correct it. Subsequent diving expeditions revealed astonishing details. Inside Erebus, cameras captured images of tables still set with plates and glasses, storage areas containing bottles and containers, the ship's bell perfectly preserved. Artifacts recovered included dishes with officers' names, buttons, writing slates, and even a leather boot. On Tyre, divers found drawers still closed in the officers' cabins, suggesting that when the ship finally sank, it had happened relatively quickly, a slow flooding rather than a violent destruction. The ships offered tantalizing new evidence but also new mysteries. Why was Tyre so far from where the expedition had reportedly been trapped? How long had the ships remained afloat after abandonment? Had anyone been aboard when they finally sank? The wrecks themselves were preserved crime scenes from history, frozen in time, waiting to reveal their secrets. The 30,000 people enslaved after Tyre's fall disappeared into history. Their names are lost. Their stories untold. They were absorbed into households across the Mediterranean, Greece, Egypt, Macedon, Asia Minor, their Phoenician heritage erased within a generation. Families were destroyed. A proud maritime culture was scattered like seeds in the wind. This is the cost we must remember when we marvel at Alexander's achievement. Yes, he built a road through the ocean. Yes, he achieved the impossible. But the price was paid in blood, blood of soldiers who died building his causeway, blood of defenders who fought for their homes, blood of innocents caught in the aftermath of conquest. The historical debate about Alexander continues to this day. Was he a visionary who united the ancient world and spread Greek culture across 3 continents? Or was he a megalomaniacal tyrant whose ambition destroyed countless lives? The answer, like most truths, is probably both. But the siege of Tyre reveals something fundamental about human nature. It shows what humans are capable of when pride and determination override all other considerations. Alexander could have bypassed Tyre. Military strategists have argued for centuries that it would have been the smarter choice. The city posed no real threat to his supply lines. The siege consumed 7 months he could have used to pursue Darius. But Alexander didn't think like a strategist. He thought like a god. And gods do not accept refusal. The Franklin expedition's legacy extends far beyond the tragedy itself. The search for Franklin opened up the Arctic, proved that the Northwest Passage existed, though it would remain impassable to commercial shipping for over a century. The expedition demonstrated the limits of Victorian-era technology and the deadly consequences of ignoring indigenous knowledge and traditional survival skills. It showed that civilization's tools, steam engines, canned food, Victorian propriety, could become liabilities rather than advantages in extreme environments. Climate change has added a bitter coda to the story. The Northwest Passage that trapped and killed Franklin's men is now increasingly ice-free during summer months. Ships regularly traverse routes that were suicide missions in 1845. The Arctic that preserved the Franklin wrecks for 170 years is warming rapidly, threatening the very sites that have given us new understanding of the expedition's fate. In the end, 129 men sailed into the Arctic seeking glory and geographic knowledge. All of them died in conditions of unimaginable hardship. But their story didn't end with their deaths. It continued through decades of searches, through the preservation of their ships in cold dark water, through the faithful keeping of oral histories by Inuit communities, and finally through modern technology revealing what had remained hidden for so long. The Franklin expedition became a haunting reminder that nature is indifferent to human ambition, that the most advanced technology can fail against ancient forces, and that sometimes, the greatest discoveries come not from conquest, but from catastrophe. The lost expedition found what it sought, the Northwest Passage did exist. But the price of that discovery was written in frozen graves, scattered bones, and 2 ships resting silently on the Arctic seafloor, monuments to both human courage and human hubris. There's something both inspiring and terrifying about that permanence. Alexander literally changed the shape of the earth to achieve his goal. When we talk about leaving a mark on history, we usually mean metaphorically. Alexander did it literally. You can stand where he stood, walk on land he created, and see with your own eyes what happens when human will refuses to bend. The question is whether we should celebrate that or fear it. Because the same determination that builds roads through oceans can also crucify 2,000 men for the crime of defending their homes. The same innovation that solves impossible engineering problems can also massacre 8,000 people in a single day. The same leadership that inspires men to achieve the impossible can also drive them to commit atrocities. The siege of Tyre is a mirror. What we see in it depends on what we bring to it. We can see human potential at its greatest. The ability to overcome any obstacle, to achieve what seems impossible, to literally reshape the world through determination and ingenuity. Or we can see human nature at its worst, the ego that demands submission, the pride that values reputation over human life, the ambition that destroys everything in its path. Perhaps the truth is that we should see both. Because that's what we are, creatures capable of the sublime and the monstrous, often in the same moment, often in the same act. Alexander the Great built a road through the ocean to conquer a city that dared to tell him no. The road remains. So does the city. So do the questions about what that achievement really means. And maybe, after 23 centuries, we still don't have good answers. Maybe we never will. But we can stand on that peninsula in modern-day Lebanon, look out at the Mediterranean waves, and remember that once, in 332 BCE, a young conqueror looked at those same waves and said, "I will walk across you." And impossibly, incredibly, terrifyingly, he did.